And now we are going to stream. Yeah, see, this is what I mean. They've decided to put it on my timeline and not Stanley Law's. So let me just work through the steps. No, we don't want it on an insurance page. And one sec. Okay. All right, good. We're in good shape. It's 11:58. I'm going to go ahead and hit go live because even though for a minute or two, by the time we welcome everyone and get going, that'll buffer any issues that we have. I will be taking questions and pulling up my Facebook on my cell phone. Okay, so we are live. Welcome everyone to the Stanley Law Office's free webinar, legal webinar today. We're going to start in just a minute or two, but as we welcome everyone in, I just want to get my mobile Facebook all set so that we can answer your questions as they come along. Okay, wonderful. I'm Angela Moonan, and I'm joined today by attorneys Joseph Stanley. Joe, you know Joe Stanley. Welcome, Joe.
Hello, Angela.
And attorney on the team at Stanley Law as well, Paul Hoffman. Paul, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Paul, you work these types of cases, and you're going to be personal injury cases that we're going to be talking about today and how your clients are impacted by that. And so as you have questions and insights and maybe some personal experience and stories, you can share those with us if you will, please. And we are also joined today by vocational expert Karen Simone. Karen Simone is also a life care planner, and we welcome you, Karen. Thank you for inputting your time and energy today.
Thank you.
And we also have with us Forensic Economist. There's not a title you hear very often, Mike. This is Mr. Mike Vernarelli, a forensic economist. We're going to learn exactly what a forensic economist is and does. Is that right, Mike?
I certainly hope so.
Okay, well, as a reminder to everyone, we do take your questions live. This is being recorded, so certainly feel free to share it, to reference it later on our website or any of our social media, and that would be, of course, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. And if you like, we do have other webinars on the Stanley Law and YouTube, stanleylaw.offices.com website and the YouTube channel, Stanley Law Offices, for other information and advocacy that you can seek out for you, your business, your family, etc. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joe, who's going to give us some context for today, determining the value of your personal injury case. Joe?
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Paul, Karen, Mike. You know, for the layperson who reads the headlines, and I just saw, you know, Kobe Bryant's estate got $28.5 million for the pictures involved in his deaths. And even that's not a personal injury case, but I think most people really don't have any concept as to how cases are valued when people are hurt. It's not a magical thing. And in fact, the law is very strict in terms of what elements of damages you have to prove and how you have to prove them. And the most objective and the most significant part of any personal injury claim is the medical expenses and lost earnings. And so what a jury hears if someone is hurt and they have a permanent disability is they'll hear about what the prior injuries were, what the prior medical expenses were, and how those injuries affected the earning capacity up until the date of the trial. In other words, was the person disabled? Did they suffer a loss of earning capacity? And what those numbers were to date. More importantly, if you have a permanent disability, you have to project what the effect of those injuries are on the future medical expenses and on the future earning capacity. And those have to be done in a scientific and objective way. So what, in almost every case involving any kind of significant injury, we as lawyers retain experts to make those evaluations. And who are those experts? Well, those are experts that we have here today. Karen Simone is a vocational rehabilitationist and life care planner. What does that mean? Well, the vocational rehabilitation part means she analyzes what the disability is of the injured party based on the medical records of the physicians involved. And then she makes a determination as to the effect of those disabilities on the earning capabilities of the injured party. Clearly only going forward, because the past is the past and those determinations were going to be made. And the same thing she makes is the determination about future medical expenses. But what she does is takes a snapshot as of, say, today's date. That's where her analysis ends, both for earning capacity and medical expenses. And that's where the forensic economist comes in. He takes those snapshots and projects them into the future, which I'm sure Mike will tell you, given the challenges of this new inflationary era, becomes more difficult. And he also does analyze a few other factors that he will talk about. But these are numbers that a jury gets to consider to determine how much harm has been caused by the negligent, at fault, responsible party. Okay. And those also are part of the bigger picture. You have these medical expenses, past and future, and lost earnings, past and future, that are combined with the non-economic damages, you know, the pain and suffering, the damages that involve items that cannot specifically be identified with a number. You know, there's some things that can be fixed. There's some things that can be helped, but there's some things that can't be fixed or helped. And that's where you have to put a number on. The jury then looks at the whole picture, though. The more that someone suffers a loss of economic ability to work or has to suffer future medical expenses, I think any jury is going to consider that in determining how much they award in the other elements that are involved in a claim. So.
Can I ask a question of Paul? Paul, do you, as an attorney on the team, when you retain a client and you start walking them through what to expect, and I mean, these cases, of course, can go on for years in some instances. So, do you share this aspect of the formula with them? Not that maybe the granular information that Mike and Karen are going to go through, but do you try to do some of this education process? What's that like, that first conversation?
Yes, and mostly it's through, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Mostly through asking the client questions, and then they'll be aware of the types of things that are going into the value of a case. First of all, I mean, we ask them, what were your injuries? And we'll collect their medical records and we'll be able to see a whole picture of their bills and injuries. And then, of course, are you employed? Did you work? How much did you lose of work? And other things too, other questions. Did you lose services at home? Did you do things at home that you can't do anymore? So I think the client in a sense educates themselves by the questions that we ask them.
Makes sense. That makes sense. All right, so Joe, would you like to begin? Would we like to have, we're going to have Karen go first because that's really the beginning of the process, yes?
That is true. And you know, and Angela, just as and that Paul was actually making the point is that this can happen to anybody, and whether there's a claim or not, these same kind of harms happen to everyone, and not everyone has the ability to bring a claim against a responsible party, but you can still appreciate the tremendous losses when somebody has a permanent disability. So yes, Karen, thank you very much again for participating, and please tell the audience about how this works.
Yeah, a little bit about you first, Karen, and a little bit how you came to this work, and then we'll share your slides and you can go from there.
Okay, thank you. I am a vocational rehabilitation specialist, expert, and a life care planner. I have been a vocational rehabilitation counselor since the early 90s, achieved a master's degree at Syracuse University in rehabilitation counseling. So I've been doing this for a long time, and rehabilitation specialists generally have master's degrees in rehabilitation counseling or a related field. We are certified rehabilitation counselors, and we typically have several years of experience working with people with disabilities as it pertains to the world of work when we enter into the field of what we call forensics, or doing a job associated with the process of litigation. But typically, a vocational rehabilitation counselor are concerned with helping people with disabilities return to work. And if they're not able to return to work, then we're concerned with helping them become as independent as possible. That's the general goal of vocational rehabilitation counselors. And then, as Angela said, I'm also a certified life care planner, which means understanding what a person's health-related goods and services are going to be needed associated with a disability.
So Karen, you intersect with people at their most vulnerable times in probably ever in their life. And I know we often talk about with Joe and his team and Paul, et cetera, that, you know, they play listener more because it's such a traumatic, dramatic occurrence. So as you go through your slides, we know that there are details and facts and knowledge, direct knowledge that goes into this, but there's an awful lot of emotional intelligence that you must have to infuse in your conversations with them to be able to be empathetic and walk that journey with them. I'm guessing at that, but.
Well, no, absolutely. And that's why generally, well, definitely vocational experts have a counseling background, because all of this work is done within the context of a counseling relationship. We have that history and we have that education. Although when we're involved in a litigation case, we're not counseling individuals, but certainly those skills help us understand where a person is coming from. But why is a vocational rehabilitation counselor involved or specialist involved in your case when there's a lawsuit? And we're involved for two reasons, and Joe mentioned this earlier, but to establish a pre-disability earnings capacity, which means what you would have earned had the person not become injured or disabled. And then secondly, now that you have sustained an injury or a disablement, what is your ability to work and earn following that disability? So, okay.
All right, and it's buffering, it's having an issue buffering for some reason, and it doesn't want to go to a larger screen. I'm going to keep trying, but you know, Murphy does tend to show up in these types of scenarios. I am going to ask you too, Karen, if you can lean even a little bit closer to your microphone. We're having a little bit of audio technical in being able to clearly hear you. So let's, we're gonna begin. And if we have to look at the slides in this format, then that's what we'll need to do. And I know there are some slides too, Karen, that you wanted me to skip over. So as we come to those, you can just let me know.
Okay, well, I'm really more or less on the loss of earnings capacity slide, which is slide number 4.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm trying to, I know that we have a short window of time, so I'm trying to hit the highlights, of course.
Yes, 1 hour today for all of those
Yeah.
watching. We have 1 hour total, so.
Right, so I wanted to explain, what my opinions are concerning vocational rehabilitation in any litigated claim. So it's the pre-disability earnings capacity, it's the post-disability earnings capacity. We consider information such as a clinical interview. So once we get a case, we interview.
Yeah, we're losing your audio. Sorry, Karen. So I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Let me get even closer.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's still wanting to go in and out, but it is a little better, yes.
Okay. So when we get a case, we want to interview the person. We review all of the medical records. We review certain pieces of legal information, such as deposition transcripts, understand what occurred. We review financial information because in order to establish what a person's pre-disability earnings capacity is, we look at what they historically earned in the past. And then any educational or employment file information is good to have as well. That includes job descriptions, previous achievements in school, any challenges while in school. That sort of information all folds into a vocational opinion about a person's ability to work. And then the next slide is elements of the clinical interview and evaluation, which I don't think we probably really need to go through. But when you go for, I'll briefly explain, when you do go for an interview and evaluation with a vocational rehabilitation expert, they're going to take a family history. People always say, why do you need to know all that? Well, we need to understand you as a whole. Who's your supports? What's your immediate family support? What's your educational background? What's your work history? So you should become prepared to explain those things.
Yes, and excuse me, Karen, and these actually are very important things if you get involved in a trial and litigation. So the clients sometimes don't like them, but as you know and I know, these are subject to considerable cross-examination and dispute sometimes, so they're incredibly important.
Yes, I mean, these are the elements that all vocational rehabilitation experts look at, whether you're retained by the plaintiff counsel or the defense counsel. We're all going to look at these specific things. So we're going to look at the nature and extent of the injury or the disablement. We're going to look at the functional limitations, meaning what limitations do you have now because of your injury or your disablement. We may do vocational testing, we may not. It depends on the circumstances
what goes into vocational, when that says vocational diagnostic testing, like it's taking actual functions and going through and digging deeper as to what that person can or cannot perform?
No, we don't do any physical testing like a functional capacity evaluation. Vocational testing is to do a screening of a person's achievement levels, academic achievement levels, what their vocational interests are. There's a variety of tests that vocational rehabilitation do to understand aptitude, achievement, and interest. Like I said, we may or may not do those tests depending on the individual.
Okay, Karen, we're losing quite a few of your words. I'm thinking that if you stay more straight onto your microphone, it tends to keep it. As soon as you turn it all to the side is when we start to lose you.
Okay. I
Okay.
don't even know where the microphone is, but
Oh.
I'll try.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
see
right in
that,
the,
like,
it's
right there,
usually
you're
right in the
perfectly
middle of
clear.
your computer, usually,
All
yeah.
right in the middle.
Yes,
There's got to be a microphone here somewhere.
Well, whatever
yes.
you're doing right now is perfect. It
Yes,
sounds
they're
really
usually,
good right
they're
now.
usually right in the middle. And the microphones
Okay.
on the computers usually aren't very good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And so functional limitations, as I mentioned earlier, are important. They are activities that are associated with work that a person may not be able to do, sitting, standing, reaching, handling, fingering. There's environmental functional limitations, such as exposure to dust, gases, fumes. They're important because that's what we use to evaluate whether or not a person can do the work that they once did, or if not, are there any other types of work that the person is able to do? So that's how we use functional limitations in our work. And I mentioned this earlier, one of our opinions that we are going to provide the attorney that retains us is pre-disability earnings capacity. So we look at your education, we look at what types of work you did, and we look at historically how much money you earned year over year. And we make an opinion about what your pre-disability earnings capacity would have been had you not become injured. I just mentioned the factors that we consider. It's not always exactly what you earned. If you are working, but you're also in the middle of earning a degree in law, is it fair to say that maybe you would have been a paralegal for the rest of your work life? Well, no. You also have to consider that you may have also gone on to become a lawyer. So we might present a few different scenarios as to what your pre-disability earnings capacity may have been. So we consider your very individual circumstances when providing that opinion. Residual employability, residual meaning what is your employability after you've sustained an injury or a disability? So maybe you were a nurse before you became injured, and then you sustained a disability where now you can only do sedentary work. Then it's up to us to make a determination as to what your employment options are, given your transferable skills and your limitations that you have. So we consider what education do you have, what skills have you achieved or attained from your work history, and then we couple that with what your limitations are and make a determination if there's any other work that we think that you can do that's available in the competitive labor market.
I was going to ask about that, Karen, because as Joe pointed out when we began today, the shifting landscape, not only of the labor market in general, but then also when you look at technology and artificial intelligence, and we could have a completely separate webinar on that, but I would think that makes it for interesting challenge for a vocational expert when there are so many adapting, changing, quickly changing opportunities and shifts in the market, et cetera.
Yes, well, that's vocational rehabilitation specialists are always concerned with the world of work. So if you're a certified rehabilitation counselor, if you do this type of work, then you are constantly being educated on the world of work and how it changes. And, as you're speaking with employers and analyzing what a person's job responsibilities were at work, you see how things evolve over time.
Right.
Residual earnings capacity. So when we make an opinion about what a person's employability is after a disablement, if I've or another vocational expert has said, okay, with your skills and abilities and your limitations, I think you can do these types of jobs. Residual earnings is attaching what the earnings are associated with those residual occupations. So residual earnings, residual meaning what's left, right? So it's your earnings capacity after you have sustained a disability. It may be the same as you were earning before. It may be less than you were earning before. It may be that you're not able to earn any wages now that you have sustained a disability. So it depends on the circumstances.
And by the way, just for the purposes, that issue is always in dispute in one shape, form, or other in almost every case. I mean, there are some cases that it's clear at one end or the other that you can do your job or you can't do anything, but many cases that is where the crux of the dispute in the future lies.
And how often, Paul, as an example, in your circumstance with a client, how often are you communicating with Karen? If you've retained her for a particular case, how often might those conversations need to take place?
I think in certain cases, if you take a medical malpractice case, for example, we'd probably from the beginning, once we know that it's an established case, we're going to have to talk quite frequently because we're going to need to prove what our damages are. What did this person do before? What can they do now? So in those types of cases, often. In other cases, once it's apparent that we're going to go to trial or it's not going to resolve, we'll also talk quite often because we'll have to determine, like Karen said, you know, what can the person do before that they can't do now? And especially in cases, I think, with a young person that may not have an established work history or maybe in college now, it's important, and especially it's important to involve the client to determine, okay, what was this person's ultimate goal, and what was their work life expectancy going to be also.
Sure, that's got to vary quite substantially when you're dealing with someone, as you say, Paul, who maybe doesn't have a demonstrated work path yet merely because of their age, and then as opposed to someone who might have been closer to retirement. I mean, those, and we're going to talk, Mike, I'm sure you're going to chime in on that matter as well. All right, so Karen, we're going to continue on here. What is a life care plan?
So a life care plan is basically an itemized list of health-related goods and services that a person needs associated with their disablement. So it's doctor's visits, it's therapy appointments, it's medications, it's any adaptive equipment that they may need, mobility devices such as wheelchairs, canes, walkers. It might even be architectural modifications to their home.
Karen, Karen, to get this information, just so that people are clear, this information, you work in conjunction with the physicians involved in this case to come up with these, or do you do this yourself, or is it a combination of both?
No, I think one of the other slides is the methodology used for life care plans.
Okay.
First of all, let me explain that a life care plan is what we call a dynamic document, meaning life care plans change over time as the individual's circumstances change. So really, it's based on what we know now is going on with the person and what is probable to occur in the future. Can those things change? Yes, of course, because people are people and their disabilities and their needs change over time or can change over time. It's also based on a standard of practice. Life care planners are typically certified. We have standard protocols that we have to follow when we prepare life care plans. It is a comprehensive assessment. It's based on what your needs are now, and we also consider what you're going to need in the future. For example, if you have a spinal cord injury, we know that as you age, your needs are going to increase. It's documented research. And then once we identify all of the items for the life care plan or the elements that you're going to need, then we research how much those cost. And that becomes the life care plan, the damage, that piece of damages. So your attorney will have 3 things to consider for damages: loss of earnings capacity, loss of household services, and cost of future medical care. Those 3 things. So at any rate, once we prepare the life care plan, as Joe said, yes, we look at the medical, not once we do, as we're preparing it, we review all of the medical records because the life care plan has to be based on your specific individual medical needs. And we do that by interviewing you, doing an in-depth review of the medical records, research and analysis for what we know about certain types of disabilities, and then coordination and conference with your treatment providers. That could be 1 treatment provider. It could be 2 treatment providers. It might be a physical therapist and a physician, or a psychologist and a physician. It depends on your individual circumstances. So that's the gist of what a life care plan is and how we put it together. I don't know if I already mentioned the elements of the life care plan. I don't know if anybody has any questions about the elements of the life care plan. But it's up to us as life care planners to understand what's going on with the person to build the life care plan. It's up to the physicians to provide us with their input into what they think you need into the future that you may not have now, or what you need now that you're currently not getting.
Karen, I have a question, because this is what people would probably want to know if I was watching this. What are the biggest pitfalls or the biggest problems that clients, injured people, have when they're working with you in this process?
The biggest problems that they have?
Yeah, the biggest pitfalls, the biggest difficulties they have.
In terms of their ability to get treatment, or I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
No, in other words, you do these reports all the time. Some people are easier than others. What are their biggest difficulties for you to be able to do a good job? Sometimes people just don't understand how it works, but what do you run into? People not understand the process? Do they say, why do you need all of this? Or what do you find is the biggest difficulty you have in trying to communicate to people what they need to do so that you get a good result?
Well, I think that sometimes it can be overwhelming for people. I ask them to tell me, regardless of what is in the medical records, I ask them to recall what doctors they see and how often they see them and what medications they take and what do they need that they currently don't have because they couldn't get funding approval for it. So I think sometimes it's overwhelming for people to remember all of those things. So I try to jog their memory by going through items, the element categories that are typically go into a life care plan. So I would say that that's probably one of the challenges on the term in terms of the plaintiff.
Okay.
How
How about them becoming forthcoming? I know I'll let you follow up with that question. Is it difficult to get people to understand that they have to be completely forthcoming with you because you have to know the good, the bad, and the ugly?
No, I think that most people, I would say, 98% of the time, people are pretty forthcoming. Because I do try to explain my role in the very beginning. I think it depends also on the circumstances. Certainly people that may have sustained a brain injury or might have some psychiatric issues, that may be a challenge in getting them to just understand what's happening in general. So I try to adapt my explanations to people according to their individual circumstances. But I would say typically people are pretty forthcoming with me.
And you were going to tell us what your other difficulty was. I presume that was getting information from all the other entities involved.
Providers.
That's just my guess. That's just my guess.
Well, you are right. Yes, it can be challenging to get some information that I need. Either it's not available or it's been requested and it's hard to just get. It's often very difficult for me to get responses from treatment providers when I ask them to comment on the life care plan or to provide their input into their needs. That can be challenging at times. But eventually we get it done one way or the other.
Now, Karen, oh, go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jan.
I was just going, we had a question here that just what drew you to this work? It's not easy work. It's not easy work. It's very in-depth work, and it's very there's people's lives and their capabilities in the future, et cetera, are kind of resting in your advisement and guidance and counsel. So what drew you to the work to begin with?
That's such a great question. This is going back to many decades now, right? I had it was my parents' best friends actually, and they were in a car train incident where they both passed away, but their son survived, and I'm still friends with his sister. This was when we were in middle school, I think, but he survived, very, very disabled and dependent on others to live. So I've always been interested in working with people. And it's funny, I started college being interested in becoming an attorney. So my undergraduate degree is in public justice. And I quickly changed my mind after I graduated and decided instead of the legal route, I wanted to work with people. But so this is a nice mesh of the two. But I did, working in vocational rehabilitation all those years, I really enjoyed. But it was my mentor, who was my professor in graduate school, Dr. Ken Regals, who I always stayed in touch with after graduate school. He did this work for many, many years in terms of the forensics and getting involved in litigation. And he took me under his wing and trained me. It's just another facet of vocational rehabilitation. And he's still my mentor today, even though he's retired. But I owe everything to him.
And fortitude and right.
Right.
And yeah, it's interesting how you were able to integrate those two aspects of your passions. So thank you for sharing that with us. So Joe, before we turn it over to Mike, Joe, do you have any other thoughts or questions specifically relating to Karen, or Paul? Do you have any other questions from your vantage point?
I'm good. No, thank you, Karen. That was great. And it's and again, it's a difficult job, and it requires a combination of a whole lot of information from, as she said, as we all know, but most people don't appreciate, the people that have to participate are sometimes very unwilling participants. And so the clients, if you take anything away from this, is that this is not an easy thing to do, and it doesn't happen overnight.
All right, so with that, for forensic economist. So we're going to start a little differently. We're going to begin with this with you, Mike. What drew you to the work that you do? How did you become a forensic economist, and why?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, I started my career, I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school at SUNY Binghamton, which is now Binghamton University, now known as Binghamton University. And I got a PhD in economics, and I wanted to teach. And I was fortunate enough to obtain an instructor position at Rochester Institute of Technology. And so I pursued a career at RIT as a professor. I was a department chair there for a number of years, and I really loved teaching. But one thing that I always wanted to do is I wanted to try to use my academic degree in the real world. I wanted to be a consultant of some type. I didn't know what type of consulting I would get involved in. I didn't know what the product would be, how to market it, or any of that. But then 40 years ago, actually, 40 years ago to the year, we got a call at the economics department from an attorney in Rochester who had at that time, it was a wrongful death case. And he was asking if there was someone who would be interested in working up the damages in this particular case. And so I spoke to him and I said, gee, I don't know anything about this, but if you give me a little bit of time to study, I'd be glad to get involved. And so over the summer, I looked into what was really an emerging field at that time. Because prior to that, the damages had been basically, for the most part, calculated by attorneys themselves. And so this industry of, forensic economics was just developing at that time. And so I studied this, and I asked the attorney at that time if he thought that this would be something that would be growing and developing. And he said, yeah, I think that we're going to need economists to do this. And so I started doing business as a sole proprietorship called Rochester Economic Consultants. And 40 years later, here I am. So that's how I got involved. I wanted to do consulting, and this was an opportunity, and it was an emerging industry. And I sort of happened to be at the right place at the right time. Sort of, that's the way I would describe it.
Wonderful. Now you have some slides for us today as well. And I'm going to share my screen and pull up yours. Let's see if we can get this one to play in a, nope, it does not. Oh, there, oh, look. I don't know why that one decided to, but here we go. Okay, so we could probably go to the next slide, right? But there's your title, and there's RIT. We see RIT on there. Okay, here we go. Take it away.
Okay, so I guess people are getting a pretty good idea of what forensic economics is just from what Joe talked about a little bit, and Karen's presentation as well. But this is a formal definition that forensic economics involves the basic application of principles of economics, okay, in the field of litigation. And so it's pretty broad. Some examples that I get involved in are probably the most important thing is personal injury cases. There are wrongful termination cases, medical malpractice. Paul Paul mentioned medical malpractice a little earlier. Even equitable distribution, economists get involved there. Me, not so much, and wrongful death. Okay, so we probably have sort of already heard this, but I don't think it's going to hurt if we hear it again, which is sort of what are the basics of a lawsuit from my perspective anyway. So one of the nice things about living in the United States is that we have this beautiful legal system that if you believe that someone has infringed upon your rights, you have recourse. You can go to a court of law and bring a lawsuit. And really the lawsuit has two parts to it. The first part is what we would call determination of negligence, which, as I have up there on the slide, did the behavior of somebody named as the defendant, did they result in harm to you? Okay, physical, mental, financial harm. And if that first determination is made, then we move to the second part, which is, okay, what is the nature? What are the damages that you suffered? And you have both a qualitative and a quantitative measure. Earlier Joe was talking about there are some things that it's certainly not within the expertise of an economist to talk about, such as pain and suffering. That is typically a very difficult area to put a number on. An economist has no special expertise, and the jury does. But in any case, a wide variety of potential damages due to harm. Okay, so where does the economist fit in? Well, first of all, and I think you picked up some of this from Karen's presentation, is that you have to determine the nature and the cause of the physical injury or perhaps death, okay? And there, the expert witness is the physician. So a doctor is going to come in and say, yeah, as a result of this car accident, this individual suffered, a broken back and has a spinal injury that he's going to have for the rest of his life, or something along those lines. So that's the first step. Then we have to look at, well, okay, we have this injury. How did it affect, or how does it affect the plaintiff's productivity? And that the individual, because of their disability, may require, as Karen pointed out in her presentation, these various medical costs that have to be incurred to deal with that disability over the remainder of that person's life. And so the expert witness in that particular area is the vocational rehabilitation consultant, talking about loss of earnings. Karen talked about pre-disability earnings, post-disability earnings, and a life care planner, which is someone who, as Karen pointed out, is trained to go in and look at the goods and services that have to be provided for this person because of the injury, the disability. And as Karen pointed out, she is trained both as a vocational rehabilitation consultant as well as a life care planner. That's not always the case. Sometimes people are just voc rehab consultants, and sometimes people are just life care planners, but Karen has both of those areas of expertise. And then finally, we get to try to determine what those economic damages are, which would be the past and future monetary loss as a result of this diminution of productivity and the projection of the medical costs. And that's where the expert witness, the economist, comes in as the expert witness. We're sort of at the end of the line, as it's jokingly said, we're sort of at the end of the food chain or what have you. And typically the economist, if a case goes to trial, the economist is the last person, the last expert to testify. Yeah, Karen, we could go to or Angela, we could go to the next one. Oh, you're already there.
Yep.
Thank you. So here's the question. How do economists value a person's productivity? Well, the answer is that within the field of economics, there has long been an area called labor economics. And within labor economics, there's a sub-discipline called human capital theory. And basically what human capital theory talks about is how is someone's productivity determined, okay? And there are various parts to it. So as you can see with the first bullet point, that sometimes somebody's productivity is just determined by what we would call their innate abilities. How much of a work ethic they have, what's their level of intelligence, what's their physical strength, okay? I'm a big Buffalo Bills fan, and so I look at somebody like Josh Allen, and no matter if I spent 1,000,000 years trying to develop into a football quarterback, I would never approach the level of Josh Allen and his skills. Okay, it's just innate abilities that
You don't think so, Mike? You don't think so? You wouldn't hold out hope for that?
No, I might get a job as an usher in the stadium selling popcorn or something, but I don't think I'd ever be a quarterback. But
and by the way, for those watching, I got a little thing in the chat from Joe Stanley. His computer decided to reboot in the middle of all of this, so he'll be back on if and when he can. So we'll keep going.
Okay, thank you. Then, besides innate abilities, people's productivity is enhanced by what's called the acquisition of human capital. And human capital is nothing more than experience, where you learn on a job, training that you get, or education. Okay, so all of those factors determine, in part, what a person's human capital is and what their productivity is. And so basically then what an economist is going to do is going to be relying upon this whole idea of human capital theory to determine the monetary value of damages. Okay.
Oh,
So,
I skipped one. Hang on one second. I need to go back. I think I did, didn't I, or no?
I don't think
Oh,
you
maybe
did.
not. No, maybe I just pulled it up. Okay.
Yeah. So how do, in general, how do forensic economists project these future earnings and medical costs? Well, as I'm fond of saying when I have to testify at a trial, economists don't have any kind of special crystal ball where we could see the future better than anyone. There is an established methodology in forensic economics for projecting, and that is looking at past behavior, because that's something that we can measure. We can look at things like earnings growth, inflation, etc. We pick a so-called experience period. That's a number of years in the past, where we measure what has happened in that experience period. In our judgment as a forensic economist, it's an appropriate period. Okay. For example, we wouldn't want to look at, if we're trying to project what's going to happen over the next 5 years, we wouldn't want to go back and look at what happened during the Great Depression or during the Roaring 20s and the 1920s. That would be, irrelevant because the economy has changed so much. So economists have to make that determination. But you look basically at the past, you determine what growth rates were, and then you apply that in the future, okay, with the basic assumption being that the future will be related to the past. And as I'm also pointing out in that bullet point, there are really two types of data that you consider. There are data which are economy-wide, statistics that are collected by the government on what was the average inflation rate over the year. We've heard a lot about inflation recently because it's been a lot higher in the last year and a half, 2 years than it had been for, probably the previous 30. So it's a hot item. But then you also look at, if you're going to project someone's earnings, you're going to look at how that individual himself or herself actually performed. and how their career progressed. So both types of data. And then the other bullet point that I have down here is that there's something called rational expectations. And all that is, it's a concept in economics that you don't want to simply blindly look at the past to project the future if you know that there's other relevant information that's going to help you make that projection. So for example, if you're going to project, if someone was a member of a labor union, let's say, and they got hurt and they can't work in that field anymore, but that the vocational rehabilitation counselor says, yeah, I think that that person would have continued in the union, then the economist would certainly want to look at the current union contract, because that would specify what the wages would be right now if that person were still working. So that's the idea of rational expectations. Okay, I had to put one slide in here to just scare people.
I was going to say, to just give us that little tick, just that little.
Yeah, you had to see the equation. Is Vernarelli a real economist? Oh yeah, he is. He's the typical nerdy economist with the equation. But anyway, basically what this equation says is that we're going to look over a number of years in the future. We determine the appropriate number of years. I'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to project what the loss would be each year, and there's various elements of the loss. And then we're going to have to do something that's called discounting to present value. And we'll talk about all of those things. So let's move away from that. Thank you. Thank you, Angela. We only
I got my fill for the year, I think, actually, in that 15 seconds.
You're topped out on that one. Okay. So there's this question of the annual economic loss that we're going to project every year. How is that projected? Okay. Well, what does it include? First of all, well, we talk about lost earnings. Karen talked about the fact that there's really like two situations, that someone suffers a loss in earnings because they have to take a job, or they're capable of working in a job with their disability where they're not earning as much. And then there's a second situation where the person is so severely injured, has such a severe disability that they don't have any ability to earn money after their accident. Now, and obviously, if you're looking at a wrongful death case because someone has passed away, they have zero earning capacity. But we also include in there things like fringe benefits that have value. Could you go back, Angela?
Yeah, I saw fringe benefits and I jumped to the next slide. Sorry.
I know you did it. That was great, but a little premature.
I'm not sure if I get back. How do I get back?
Next. Oh no.
Yes, no, I know, but this is a different format. Here we go down here. Okay,
there we go. Thank you. So Karen mentioned non-market services, household services. People do work in their homes. Cleaning their homes. People do their own home renovations. These things have economic value, but they're not traded in the marketplace. So a role of an economist is to put a value on those activities. And then, of course, future medical costs. Okay, so the economist then typically projects the annual loss for the first year in the future, and then we adjust that annual loss with a growth factor, an inflation factor, or an increase in wages for each of the years in the future. Now, Angela, I am ready to move. Thank you so much. So we sort of talked about this, what goes into determining that annual loss. I sort of mentioned fringe benefits received, the education and training of someone, the relevant contractual agreements if you're in a union or if you have an employment contract. Then there's the question of how old were you at the time of the injury? Because there's something that economists have discovered in the research, which is called life cycle, that people, when they're younger, first entering the labor force, they start at a relatively low wage, but their salary goes up rapidly, typically faster than inflation. And then they hit a point about like age 55 or so, where the annual earnings actually goes down a little bit on average. It doesn't happen with everyone, but you want to take that into consideration. And then, of course, the final factor that we sort of already mentioned is the earnings growth rate in the industry or the economy. Okay, thank you. So, want to just talk a little bit about the difference between personal injury and wrongful death. And it really sort of, we've sort of gone over this before, especially with Karen's presentation, that in personal injury, the annual loss of earnings becomes the difference between what the earnings were or the fringe benefits without the disability compared with the earnings that you'll be able to make or fringe benefits that you get with the disability. And in wrongful death, there is no, obviously, as I said before, there's no future earning capacity, but an additional consideration that an economist has to be concerned with is something called a personal consumption expenditures, and that is what the person who passed away, we call the decedent, what that person would have spent on himself or herself, that has to be sort of netted out, and what would be available to the heirs or the survivors of the surviving family members or what have you, that would be so that's another consideration. Okay. This was something that I heard Paul refer to in some of his comments about the work-life expectancy. So that with respect to a life care plan, typically the services, the medical services that or goods that a disabled individual is going to need will last over, or will be required rather, over the lifetime of the individual. So we would use a life expectancy table that's published by the government that looks at, on average, how long would someone live. Some people live longer, some people live fewer, but economists work with statistical averages. That's part of our methodology. And then as far as the loss of earnings, and this is what Paul, I think, specifically mentioned, was the idea of a work-life expectancy. So a work-life expectancy is quite similar to a life expectancy, but it takes some additional factors into account. It looks at the probability of death, the probability of future disability, about people that leave the labor force on their own accord. That's what we're calling the voluntary separation from the labor force, these sorts of things. And again, these work-life expectancy tables are developed by the government. The government published this statistics. There are some forensic economists that work with, that further develop these tables and refine them. Okay, and then finally, the point that I have down here is that as a result, like, could you go back to just that one?
Sure.
Yeah, because I want everyone to see that bullet point down there about the fact that vocational experts have the expertise to give an opinion as to whether someone's injury is actually going to reduce their work-life expectancy. And someone, as a result of their injury, there are statistics out there and a methodology that the voc rehab person like Karen, voc rehab expert, employs that can and where she could make a determination of how much someone's work-life expectancy would be shortened. Thank you, Angela. We could now move on to that.
Oh, sure.
And so finally, the last thing that I referred to is that we have to discount to present value. Okay, and so the reason is that money you're going to get in the future isn't equivalent to the same amount of money that you're going to get today. And I said, hey, pose a little thought experiment to yourself. Would you rather have me give you $100 today? Or if I could be trusted, assume that I could be trusted, I'd give you that same $100 1 year in the future. Well, virtually everyone is going to say, give me the $100 today, because I could spend it today, or I could just take it and put it in some kind of an investment and maybe get $100 plus interest, 5% or whatever in the future. So that's the reason why discounting. Let's go to that next slide, Angela. And so the general methodology of forensic economics throughout the country is to discount future money to present value using interest rates. We don't have to get into we don't want any reference to that equation again. That's for sure. Right, Angela?
You got it.
We don't want to touch that one again. Now, there is a bit of an oddity of New York case law. In fact, case law varies from state to state, which is sort of interesting. But in New York, the courts say that you do not discount at the time of trial. You don't discount to present value, that the economist just presents the undiscounted or inflated values. Then after a verdict is rendered, okay, there's a special formula and a hearing that occurs where the discounting takes place. Okay, so it's called a 50B or 50A hearing. But anyway, that pretty much does it. Thank you.
So I do have a question. So
yeah, please.
Since you and in this example as well, Karen, you're both in New York, and you just brought up that case law obviously varies, and that's why attorneys are they're admitted to bars for different states, et cetera, to practice law. So as you may know, Joe has an office in Pennsylvania. Stanley Law has cases in Pennsylvania. Joe, are you able to can Mike and Karen apply their expertise to cases in other states, or is it just like lawyers where they have to be in that particular, they're only credible within that particular state?
No, numbers and these analysis.
These translate.
They transfer. They don't have anything to do with the vagaries of state personal injury law. The numbers are numbers and evaluations are evaluations. Exactly how they play out is different from place to place, but actually the methodologies are the same. New York's rules are somewhat interesting because actually in medical malpractice cases, it's not even as simple as that. The juries don't even give awards. They have to decide how many years in the future based on a discount rate that the expert has to testify to at the trial. So the economist in a medical malpractice case doesn't actually ever even give numbers. The jury is supposed to do his job, which is whoever came up with that idea is never been in a courtroom, clearly, but that's how things go. The people who make these laws really have no idea what they're doing. So you end up with, that's true in other states too. That's not just New York, but New York seems to come up with some rather bizarre analysis. No one, by the way, I've never had a trial on a med mal case where the lawyers wanted the jury to try to figure out what the discount rate was, because we would always agree to it, because what would they do? If you saw those numbers, you saw the one formula, but it's even more complicated than that. So you would end up having to have two economists testify about how the jury is supposed to compute a discount rate. And believe me, they're not going to have any idea. Most lawyers don't even know what it is, let alone trying to have a jury decide that this is the discount rate we're going to apply on this case. So, but that's just something, it's the way it is.
So Joe, do you have any questions for
Just
Mike?
one more. Mike, you you do statistical analysis other than the fringe benefits and the value of the household services. Karen still has the ability to make an independent determination. She can give her, regardless of what the tables say, she could say the work life expectancy. I think this person is X years, regardless of what the tables say, because there's tables that say disabled people's work life expectancy is X years. So that's a, and then the life expectancy, if we think it's going to change, you have to have a medical opinion that's going to say the life expectancy for this person shortened and therefore X. And sometimes defendants do that so they don't have to pay as much. They're going to say, well, there's an argument. Yeah, we shorten his life so we don't have to pay here, but you shouldn't have to pay on the other side of that. You shorten his life by 7 years, but those are sometimes arguments they do make.
Yes, that's correct.
So, yeah, it is fascinating, and it really becomes it. If anybody takes out from all of this, there's a lot of issues, and when you have disabilities, just looking at the economic consequences are far more startling than people would think about face value. So, if you have the ability to plan to insure for some of these losses, you might want to think about that. And I'm not trying to sell disability insurance, but disability is far more likely to happen than death.
I have, there's a question here also, one final question before we wrap. How do, Mike and Karen, do you ever confer? Is there ever any need to confer with one another as you are collaborating or presenting your findings and your research? Is that ever applicable, or no? You work in silos and that's it?
Who wants to go first, Karen?
I'll
Let me go ahead. Let me
I'll
jump
answer
in.
that question. I'll answer that question. Typically, are you going first or am I going first?
No, you go first. Ladies
Okay.
first.
Typically, the only time that I speak with the economist is when they have a question about my opinions. If they don't understand something, if it's confusing to them, because life care plans, especially in the complicated life care plans, complex like paraplegia or severe traumatic brain injury, sometimes the life care plans get very complicated. And the economists will reach out to me to make sure they understand what I have put in my plans and that it all makes sense. Because if it doesn't make sense to an economist, it's not going to make sense to a jury.
Anything to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I would just say that I've dealt with various and interacted with a number of voc rehab experts over my career, and I always find that Karen's approach is very clear, and if I have any questions, she's terrific at getting back and explaining it to me. So I think that it's important. Karen and the voc rehab person, they're going to form their own opinion. I don't have any say in what their opinion is, but as I form my opinion, which is also done independently, we have conferred and said, hey, how is this going to fit without, at the same time respecting the independence of our respective professions. So Karen's a great person to work with. That's just a little plug I'm going to put in for her.
Oh, gee, thanks, Mike. You too.
I've learned a lot, Joe. I mean, you're so close to this, and maybe Paul, you've learned some things too, but as attorneys, you're so close to this all the time. But I think what you both have done, I want to applaud you for this, is taken a fairly complex, sophisticated methodology and framework and made it understandable for the layperson. So I want to thank you for that, because I consider myself that as I'm looking in. And I think about, different family members and different things, to Joe's point, where they may never have had necessarily a personal injury case, but their work was impacted, as well as their mental health and all of that, because of something that they did, especially physical laborers. people who have a very physical tasking, plumbers and construction workers. My dad was a construction worker, etc. And while he never had a direct personal injury, as the impact that what you can and cannot do anymore, I mean, it's a very real thing. And so I want to thank you both for taking that complicated subject matter and making it understandable. Joe and Paul, we are over on our time by just 11 minutes, but are there any further questions or comments that, Joe, that you'd like to add before we close out?
No, I think it was great. And I thank Karen and Mike for their time. Is great because their time is valuable and it is very helpful. And they always, as usual, do a great job.
Yes, thank you
you.
all. And thank you, Paul. And again, for everyone, this, of course, will remain on Facebook. You will also ultimately be able to find it at stanleylawoffices.com, as well as our YouTube channel. And please follow us and share and continue on the path with us of educating and advocating for people's rights. And the insights that are presented through these webinars are with that intention, to give you more information, because as Joe says, knowledge is valuable. You should always have more of it. So thank you all. And we'll see you next time on our next webinar. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know. Thank you.